No Man's Sky Aerons, a fan fiction written by William Smith. The desert was still holding on to the night when Elena Voss pulled off the interstate and onto the long access road that led to the NASA test facility. The headlights caught nothing but scrub, dust, and the occasional lonely fence post, relics of a ranching life that had been bled out of the land decades ago. She kept one hand on the wheel and the other on the cracked plastic of her travel mug, lukewarm coffee sloshing against the sides. The mug had been with her since grad school, a cheap giveaway from a physics conference in Houston. The lettering was worn to ghosts of equations no one could make out anymore. She liked it that way. The road hummed beneath her tires, the car vibrating with a low growl. The AC had a rattle in it that made her think of loose teeth. She let it run anyway. The desert could turn into an oven once the sun took hold, and she needed to keep herself cool for what lay ahead. The caffeine was bitter and burnt, but it was fuel, and fuel mattered more than taste. Her knee popped when she adjusted her leg, the joint stiff from too many late nights hunched over simulations. She winced, pressing it with her palm, and kept her eyes on the horizon where the stars were fading. The night sky was peeling back like a curtain, one pinprick at a time extinguished by the slow advance of dawn. And yet, even in its dying hours, the sky above the desert looked eternal, vast as scripture, heavy with silent witness. The stars did not twinkle here. They burned cold and unblinking, like the eyes of gods. A thin band of violet spread low across the east, bruising the world with color. For a moment, Elena thought of her father's hand on her shoulder when she was a girl, pointing up through a backyard telescope, naming constellations as if he were teaching her the language of another world. She blinked it away before the memory settled too deep. The checkpoint came into view. Concrete, steel fencing, and the sharp geometry of floodlights that cut across the dawn. She slowed, rolled down the window, and offered her badge. The guard, young, buzz-cut, the kind of kid who looked like he still lived on protein shakes, scanned it, then gave her a nod. "Big day, Doctor." "Voss." She managed a smile, though it felt brittle on her face. "That's what they tell me." The gate clattered open. She drove through, the tires crunching gravel, and followed the strip of road toward the facility's heart. The desert stretched on either side of her, empty yet not silent. The land had a voice, the hiss of sand shifting in the faint wind, the creak of dry brush, the faint cry of some bird she could not name. In the distance, the jagged mountains loomed like the bones of giants left to rot under a merciless sky. To her, it felt less like a test site, and more like the staging ground of an old myth, a place where humans might dare to summon gods and pay the price for it. Ahead, the research compound rose from the plain, low buildings, domes gleaming faintly, the launch gantry skeletal against the brightening sky. It looked both temporary and eternal, like all human endeavors in the face of the cosmos. Elena parked in her assigned spot. The car ticked as the engine cooled. She sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel, staring through the windshield at the facility. A knot tightened in her chest. Excitement, fear, both braided together until she couldn't tell them apart. She thought of the others, the engineers, the physicists, the military liaisons, all of them circling around her like planets around a star, but never close enough to touch. They respected her, yes, admired her, maybe, but she had seen it in their eyes. She was the one willing to burn herself for this, and no one wanted to stand too near when that fuse ran out. Her hand trembled as she reached for the coffee again. She finished the last sip, bitter sludge at the bottom, and grimaced. She placed the mug in the passenger seat, where it wobbled on a stack of papers, and finally forced herself out of the car. The desert air met her in a rush, cool but dry enough to chap her lips. Her boots crunched the gravel. Her knee creaked as she straightened, and she felt the stiffness run through her hips, her shoulders, her spine. 38 years old, and her body already whispered of time's price. She rolled her shoulders, squared them, and walked toward the entrance. Above her, the last of the night stars still glimmered faintly, stubborn against the day. She caught herself whispering a half-thought. Don't fade yet. Stay with me a little longer. The automatic doors hissed open, spilling sterile light across the desert grit clinging to her boots. She stepped inside, leaving the ancient plane behind her, trading its silence for the hum of machinery and the clipped voices of technicians preparing for the impossible. She was here, and whatever came next, there was no turning back. The prep chamber smelled of ozone, disinfectant, and nervous sweat. Elena stepped into the clean white glare and was immediately surrounded by the quiet shuffle of technicians. They moved with choreographed efficiency, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. Every gesture, every clipped instruction, carried the weight of risk. "Arms out, Doctor," Voss, one of them said. She obeyed, standing on the raised platform while the team worked. Straps were cinched across her chest, pulling the suit snug until it felt like a second skin. The material resisted at first. Stiff, synthetic layers designed for both insulation and structural reinforcement, then yielded as it warmed to her body heat. She felt the bite of pressure around her shoulders, sharp enough to remind her this was no spacewalk suit. This was a coffin, lined with wires and prayers. A hiss filled her ears as coolant lines engaged, flowing pale mist around her torso. It smelled faintly metallic, like cold pennies. She flexed her fingers, and the gloves clicked with a faint electronic acknowledgement. A magnetic clank followed as the boots locked to the platform, not with ceremony, but with a sound that made her gut clench, as though she'd been shackled. "Vitals steady," a technician murmured. Another confirmed, "Telemetry syncing." Elena closed her eyes for a second, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing. Each inhale echoed inside the helmet, each exhale a rush of condensation that brushed her lips before vanishing. The suit amplified her own body, making her feel both more alive and more trapped. The technician stepped back, leaving her in the spotlight. Two figures emerged from the observation mezzanine above the chamber, separated by glass but unmistakable. Mission Director Hayes moved with clipped precision, a man built of straight lines. His hair was cut regulation short, though no regulation applied here, his suit pressed until the seams looked like blades. He didn't fidget, didn't soften. When he spoke, it was with the exactness of someone used to being obeyed. "Elena." His voice carried through the intercom, low and measured. "Final confirmation. You understand the risks of this procedure." She tilted her head back to look at him through the helmet glass. "I wrote the risks, Hayes." A shadow of a smile touched his mouth. Not warmth, but approval. Beside him stood Dr. Mira Patel, lab coat half-buttoned, hair in a loose knot that had clearly been tightened and retied a dozen times in the last hour. Patel leaned forward against the glass, knuckles white. Where Hayes was steel, she was nerves. "Elena, you don't have to prove anything," Patel said, voice trembling despite the speaker distortion. "The equations work on paper. That's enough. If this—" She gestured vaguely, hands trembling. "If this goes wrong, there isn't a second chance." Elena's chest tightened. Patel had been her friend since Caltech. Study sessions fueled by vending machine coffee, late nights debating cosmology like they could solve it themselves. She could see the memory of those years still living in Patel's eyes, even here in the sterilized chamber. Hayes cut in before Elena could reply. "Dr. Patel, this is neither the time nor the place for hesitation. We've committed." So has Dr. Voss, his gaze flicked back down to her. "Haven't you?" The question was a knife edge. Elena felt it press against her resolve. She swallowed, then forced a grin that felt heavier than it should. I've never been good at backing down, sir. Ask anyone. Patel's lips parted, but no sound came. She pressed her forehead to the glass for a moment, then stepped back, arms folded tight. The technicians resumed their work, snapping in data links, sealing ports, locking her into the cockpit harness. Every click echoed like a rivet in a coffin lid. The straps bit into her chest and thighs. A final buckle ratcheted across her waist until she could feel the suit pressing bone against muscle. Hayes's voice again. Telemetry green across the board. Launch window remains open. Proceed to insertion. A hydraulic arm lowered her capsule hatch. The hiss of seals closing filled the chamber. For a moment, Elena felt like Jonah inside the whale, swallowed by something vast and merciless. Inside the helmet, her own breath fogged the edges of her view. She thought of the desert sky outside, wide, eternal, and ancient as any myth. It pressed against her memory like a prophecy fulfilled. She caught Patel's eyes one last time through the glass. Her friend mouthed something without the intercom carrying it. A single word. Elena thought it might have been "don't." The hatch sealed with a hydraulic groan, cutting off the voices, the glass, the world she knew. Only the hiss of coolant, the hum of systems, and the thunder of her own heart remained. She was alone. The hatch sealed with a final hydraulic groan, and the world collapsed into the pod. The silence was not complete. It never was. But it was the kind of silence that made every sound of her body monstrous. Her breathing rasped inside the helmet, every exhale a fog across the visor that thinned only to return with the next inhale. The suit's sensors chirped softly as they tracked her pulse. The throb of her heartbeat filled her ears, louder than the hum of the craft systems, louder even than the quiet drone of the coolant pump. It was as if her body had been amplified while the rest of the world was muted. The cockpit was coffin close. Barely enough room for her arms within the harness, her shoulders pressed against the padded walls. Her knees bent sharply, shins nearly grazing the underside of the console. There was no comfort, no luxury. This was a machine built for a single purpose, survival long enough to witness the unknown. A bead of condensation slid down the inner curve of her visor. She tried not to follow it with her eyes, but the motion drew her attention. It dropped, trembling, and spattered against her cheek. The dampness it left behind itched against her skin. She closed her eyes, focusing on breathing. In, out, measured. But the memories intruded. They always did in tight spaces. Her ex-husband's voice, not shouting, never shouting, but cutting her down with clinical precision. "You love the stars more than you ever loved me." He'd meant it as accusation, but part of her had taken it as truth, and truth was always harder to shake. Her brother's face, years younger, angry under a haze of alcohol. "You're never here, Lena. You leave us behind like we don't matter." He hadn't answered her calls since. She wondered even now if he'd hear about this test, if he'd care. The suit's straps pressed into her shoulders, heavy, unyielding. She shifted, and the harness groaned like old leather, though it was polymer and steel. The pressure across her chest was so tight it almost felt like a hand, pinning her down, daring her to keep breathing. "Comm check." Hayes's voice cut through the comms, flat and precise. "Do you read?" "Reading you." Her own voice sounded strange, muffled and metallic, like someone else was speaking. "Vitals steady. Comm line clear. Proceeding to countdown." The words echoed, but it was the countdown that made her mouth go dry. The technicians had rehearsed it 100 times. On paper, in simulations, in sterile drills. But here, sealed inside this coffin hurtling toward the unknown, the numbers felt less like engineering and more like ritual. The console lights dimmed, replaced by a crimson glow. Numbers appeared across her HUD. T-60. Her chest rose and fell with deliberate effort. She could almost hear her father's voice whispering star names: Orion, Cassiopeia, Andromeda, his finger pointing up from the backyard telescope, his hand warm on her shoulder. She clung to it like a talisman. T minus 45. The coolant hissed again, rushing like a serpent through the tubes at her spine. The pressure tightened across her ribs. She thought of her ex-husband's words again, but now they mingled with chants she'd heard in dreams since the simulation drills began. Deep, guttural syllables she couldn't possibly have known. T minus 30. Her pulse spiked, the HUD flashing warnings. She forced her breath slower, counting each inhale, each exhale, as though matching the numbers on the display. T minus 20. The craft systems began to hum in resonance, deep bass vibrations that rattled through the frame. It sounded like a chant, each note layering atop the last, growing heavier, as if the pod itself was calling on forces older than humankind. T minus 10. The numbers burned crimson against her visor. Each syllable from Hayes came down like scripture, words repeated through history. 10. Her mother's piano, ivory keys under gentle fingers. 9. Her brother slamming a door. 8. A desert sky, constellations whispered like secrets. 7. The smell of burned coffee, bitter as regret. Each number weighed more than the one before. They weren't seconds anymore. They were steps into something vast, ancient, and irreversible. T minus 3. Her chest locked, her hands clenched on the controls. T minus 2. The hum swelled to a roar, every bone in her body vibrating. T minus 1. The world held its breath. 0. The pod roared alive, a beast waking under her skin. Elena's teeth clacked hard enough she thought they'd shatter. The straps dug deeper into her shoulders, ribs compressed until she couldn't tell if she was breathing or just remembering how. Her vision stuttered, the numbers on the HUD tearing themselves into ribbons of red static. A scream of metal ran through the pod's frame, not from stress, but from something stranger, wronger, like the machine knew it was being asked to do something it was never born to do. The hum became a howl. The stars outside stretched, smeared, bent like liquid glass. Darkness leaked between them, blacker than any void she had ever studied. Her mind rebelled, trying to shape the sight into familiar terms, but physics had already broken its covenant. Glass spiderwebbed across her visor, not from impact, from reality. Hairline cracks of light splintered, crawling in fractal veins, expanding as though her own view of the world were shattering under pressure. Her body vibrated violently, every organ jittering out of sync. She could feel her bones, not as solid things but as notes in a discordant chord, each one plucked by unseen hands. Elena, do you copy? Hayes's voice cut across the comms, jagged, fragmented, stretched thin like a recording slowed to half speed. Cop-P. She opened her mouth to answer, but only choked. Her voice had nowhere to go. The air inside the helmet was thick, syrupy, resisting every word. Then the memory came. Her mother at the piano, bathed in the amber glow of a living room lamp, fingers moving with gentle certainty, coaxing out a melody Elena had heard since childhood. Soft, patient, almost prayer-like. The sound filled her, steady and warm, something to hold on to. The notes warped. Keys slammed off beat, the tone souring, stretching. The melody fractured, each chord doubling back on itself until it was no longer music, but a grinding, broken machinery of sound. The piano's wood groaned. Strings snapped like tendons. Her mother's hands blurred, fingers bending at impossible angles. And still, the tune persisted, mutilated, echoing across the chamber of her mind as if some vast presence were trying to play her memory instead of the piano itself. Her scream joined the music, though she didn't know if it was real or only inside. The pod's walls bent inward, then outward, swelling as though they were breathing with her. The console gauges flickered between Earth measurements and glyphs she couldn't read. Angular, alien shapes in burning red that danced like runes on fire. Then the HUD froze. For 3 long seconds, everything stopped scrolling. Warnings, symbols, readouts, all vanished. Only a single number remained, glowing stark and red at the center of her visor, 16. It pulsed once, twice. Then the rest of the data stormed back, drowning it out, as if the system itself had swallowed the mistake and refused to admit it had ever happened. For an instant, she saw the desert outside again, the dawn sky, purple bruises on the horizon. Then the image folded into itself, the mountains bending like molten wax, the sun curling into a spiral. She was falling, rising, both, neither. The straps across her body cut deeper, drawing blood from her shoulders. Her legs cramped violently, toes curling inside the magnetic boots. She thought her spine had split. Every vertebra flared as though someone were prying her open one bone at a time. Light surged. Not white. Not anything she could name. It burned crimson gold, the shade of molten metal poured into cracks of a dying world. It filled her helmet, her eyes, her lungs, until she felt she was drowning in light. "Mother," she gasped, though she couldn't hear her own voice. The piano broke apart entirely. No melody now, only a roar, the hammering of keys without hands, the splintering of wood, the shriek of strings snapping into silence. Then everything was gone. The pod, the straps, the suit, her body. She was weightless, not in the way of orbit or free fall, but in the way of unbeing, like she had been erased from the page but could still feel the phantom ink clinging where her name had been. A single sound lingered, faint, impossible. The toll of a bell. It reverberated deep, slow, each strike echoing like it was counting not seconds, but eras. She reached for it, though she had no hands, and then she fell. The light was everything.
Not just brightness, but substance. It poured through the pod, through her, until she wasn't sure where her body ended and the flood began. It filled her lungs like molten air, pressed against her eyes until she thought they'd burst, clung to her skin in searing sheets.
And then it collapsed. Darkness surged in, fast as a wave breaking. A silence so total it felt like deafness swallowed her. Her HUD sputtered. Symbols cascaded, alien glyphs repeating in loops, red against black. They flickered into fragments of English, then nonsense strings, then back again. For a heartbeat, the screen froze on a single word: anomaly. Then it all dissolved in static. The pod lurched. Gravity returned like a hammer blow, slamming her against the harness. She screamed as straps cut deeper, ribs creaking. A new sound split the silence. Alarms, high and shrill, filling the cockpit in a chorus of panic. Through the visor, she saw not the familiar stars of home, but constellations twisted beyond recognition. They bled colors she'd never seen in nature, hues that shimmered and pulsed like living veins across the sky. They bent as she fell, stretching into spirals. Clouds closed around her, not white, not even storm gray, but green and bruised purple, lit from within by flashes of hostile light. Lightning raked horizontally across the atmosphere, carving scars that hung for seconds before fading. The pod shrieked. Hull plates rattled, bolts strained, heat washed against her faceplate. "Stabilizers offline," her HUD managed to say, voice distorted, broken into halves. "Stab. Line. Off." The pod spun. Her stomach surged into her throat. She caught glimpses between the clouds, a world below, writhing in storms. The land was a smear of jagged ridges and deep scars, rivers of molten glow threading between them. The cockpit shook violently. Panels snapped free, wires lashing like live serpents. Sparks filled the air, acrid and sharp. She tried to raise her arms, but the harness pinned her down, digging so deep into her collarbone she thought something cracked. She sucked in a ragged breath, fought the panic. Hands clawed at the controls. Fingers found levers, toggles. Instinct overrode terror. Deploy! She choked on the word. Tried again. Deploy chute! The HUD spit back nonsense. Error. 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 The pod jolted hard, yanked upward as emergency thrusters fired. She slammed into the harness, head snapping forward. Something hot trickled from her nose, smeared across the inside of the visor. Clouds parted in a violent tear. The surface rose to meet her. Forests, or what looked like forests, stretched across the land, black and jagged as though the trees were made of obsidian spears. Between them, scars of glowing rivers pulsed orange, lava bleeding through fractured earth. Fauna moved across the ridges, silhouettes like nothing she had ever studied. Too many legs, too many eyes, bodies shifting in ways that defied vertebrate logic. The pod screamed again, hull tearing, metal rending. A red warning pulsed across her HUD, impact in 00:14. God, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant to pray or curse. The pod slammed into the tree line, branches cracked like bones shredding across the hull. She was thrown forward, back, forward again, every organ rattling loose. The harness cut like knives, but kept her inside as the pod tore through trunks, scattering obsidian splinters that glowed faintly as they shattered. A final crash sent the pod rolling into a ravine. Metal screeched against stone. Sparks lit the cockpit in manic bursts. Then, with one last juddering grind, it stopped. Silence. Her breath fogged the visor again. The alarms cut out. Only the hiss of coolant and the faint ping of cooling metal filled the void. She tried to move. Pain answered from everywhere, ribs, shoulders, neck. She tested her legs, flexed her fingers, bruised, cut, bleeding, but alive. The HUD flickered once more. For a moment, only a single number showed. 16. It pulsed faintly, then vanished, replaced by static. Elena sagged against the harness. Outside, through the cracked viewport, she saw the alien sky clearing, storms pulling back like curtains to reveal a sun too large, too close, burning white against the violet heavens. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She licked the blood from her lips, stared at the alien horizon, and whispered hoarsely into the silence. Where the hell am I?